Thank you. I'm just going to jump right in with prayer and go before the Lord, and then we'll get rocking and rolling, right? Lord, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. What a wonderful night, Lord. Everybody seems to be healthy in my home. I pray the same thing for our listeners, our watchers, Lord. I really pray for order and blessing in their families. Whoever's watching, thank you that people are taking time to listen in and comment tonight. I pray that you would bless them for taking that time. And I pray that you would bless our thoughts, bless our conversation. I pray that you would keep our minds open our hearts and minds to hear from you tonight, and to have really honest conversations about important things that, unfortunately, so many people, even in your church, don't want to talk about. We're going to do that boldly here by your grace. Again, Lord, temper our conversation. Help us to be brutally honest when necessary, but to be factual in everything that we say and to be measured in our claims. We love you, Lord, and we thank you again for this opportunity. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so you guys probably saw a post earlier today expressing our intent to talk about something that the church, frankly, doesn't talk very much about today. And part of the reason I would argue it doesn't talk about it is because it doesn't know what it actually means. What actually is masculinity? What's the difference? Is there a difference between masculinity and manhood? I know that people use them interchangeably, but we need to distinguish between the two. What does the Bible have to say about biblical manhood? This is something Nico feels very strongly about. I do as well. And we're frustrated. Just being honest with you guys, we're very, very frustrated that this all-important topic is either ignored by the church or it's completely misrepresented, frankly, by the church. There is a social gospel out there that demeans the concept of masculinity. It puts the modifier toxic next to masculinity. And I just want to be very, very clear about this. There's nothing toxic about masculinity. There are males that are idiots. Those exist, right, Tyler? Wouldn't you agree that there are some males that exist? Toxic males in the sense that they're idiots. But that's not what they mean. They go beyond the notion that people can behave like idiots. And by the way, it's not just men. It's women too. Women can behave like idiots too. I know quite a few idiotic women, just as many idiotic men. So there's no franchise on that by gender. But they mean something a little more sinister, I think, and a little more problematic. What they argue is that there's something inherently toxic, inherently evil, inherently bad, inherently problematic about masculinity. And is that true? I mean, do they have a point? What do you guys think? We want to kind of flesh this out a little bit and talk it through tonight. I don't know at what point Nico's going to come in the conversation here, so I kind of want to tease you guys a little bit, if you would, to weigh in. Give us your thoughts. And I know sometimes as we look at the commentary, I really appreciate you guys talking back and forth. I love that. But let's try to stay on topic if we could. We look at your comments. We look for comments that are pertinent to what we're talking about, and we try to pick some out, Tyler. I need your help to do that.
Yeah.
We try to pick some out that we think will add to the conversation. We don't want any that'll distract from what we're talking about. So please, I just welcome your thoughts, anything that you think will add to the conversation. What's going on? What's with the assault? Because it's an assault. It's an institutional assault from academic institutions to political institutions. Dare I say it, to the American Psychological Association. I don't know if you guys are aware, but there is a guidance. It's fairly new. It's a couple years old. It's called the Guidance on Psychological Practices on Men and Boys. Let that sink in. There's a guidance on the best practices, best psychological practices as it pertains to men and boys. Now, the reason I ask you to just pause and reflect on that, because this is the same institution that argues that there's really no difference between men and women, right? So what is a man? And you've heard the joke, what's a woman, right? We have unfortunately, refresh my memory on her name, but I'm going to say it's Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's the
right Supreme Court.
Yeah. Our latest and most recent United States Associate Justice, Supreme Court Justice, who was asked during a confirmation hearings what a woman is. Pretty straightforward question, and she refused to answer the question. And this is a prevailing academic theory now, that there's really no such thing as a woman because gender is fluid. Men are women, women can be men, it doesn't matter. So we have this prevailing academic theory that is in our academic institutions, it's in political organizations, it's pitched by the halls of government, and it's found its way to the American Psychological Association. The idea that there's no difference, no objective difference between men and women. Brother, I went ahead and prayed us in. Come on in. And that there's no difference between men and women. This is the academic position of the American Psychological Association. And yet they have released a guidance on how to psychologically practice on men and boys. So I propose to you that this is a very confused organization from the get-go. If they don't know what a woman is and they can't objectively define what a man is, then why should we listen to any guidance that they offer on how we should practice psychologically or provide psychological treatment to men and boys? Okay, so these are the guys that are driving the latest sort of academic work on masculinity. Okay, so let's start there for a moment. A confused organization. What's their position? Their position is that masculinity is toxic, and they describe what that is. They believe and they argue that masculinity is inherently violent. It's discriminatory. It demeans women. It makes men violent. It means that men are slaves to aggression, right? And it does very, very little to espouse the good. Is all violence bad? Is all aggression bad? If I'm in my home, an intruder bursts in, should I try to reason with the intruder, or should I try to subdue him with intense and quick and decided aggression? I think you would argue it would be the latter. Is all aggression bad? I would be pretty violent in doing that. Is all violence bad? And yet that's the pitch. All masculinity is toxic, and it's toxic because it is violent and it is buried in aggression, and it is demeaning to all women. Those claims are false. They really are. Masculinity is, and I'm going to chat with Nico as soon as he gets here on this, but to get him to weigh in. But masculinity and manhood are different things. The Bible has lots to say on manhood. Masculinity is those physical and personality traits that are inherent in maleness, right? Men are uniquely physically strong compared to women. That's a masculine trait. They do tend to be aggressive. They do tend to be enthusiastic about physical labor and activity. They tend to be rather competitive. Yes, prone to aggression and violence, more so than women. And I think I just described how not all of those things are inherently bad. It depends on the circumstances. But all of the things that I just described right now are pitched in really negative terms, and that's just not true. What's the difference between masculinity and manhood? It's useful to think of masculinity as those traits, uniquely male traits and personality traits, physical traits, as being tools to make good and righteous manhood possible. So how does the Bible describe manhood? Right? Let's start
I
there.
am curious to know. By the way, to add, Jeff said young men need role models. How does the church step up for young men who might not have a dad in the home? Spiritual mentors?
Yes. Yeah. So they need both masculine role models and role models who behave in biblical ways, right? Scripturally sound ways. What does that mean? I want to just tear away the cobwebs here for just a moment. The Bible describes manhood in these terms. Fundamentally, humility is critical. In order to be a man of God, a starting position is I'm deeply imperfect. I'm a sinner. I've got problems, and I've got problems apart from Christ, right? That's my starting position, that I am deeply broken apart from Christ. That's Romans 3:23. And that I desperately need Christ for salvation. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. And that I need to be committed once I accept Christ as my Lord and my Savior, the governor of my heart, my soul, and my home. I need to be deeply committed to pursuing him, to knowing what matters to him, and to learning his word. Those are propositions you'll find, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12, Romans chapter 12, verse 2, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. So it's not enough to just start from a humble position. It's not enough to just be saved, but then to be committed then into living out my salvation by God's grace in a way that matures me in Christ. So those are attributes that every biblical man should have and walk in. Having said that, what does that look like in the home? So a couple things. I already talked about humility. We should be protecting our families, no? We should be providing, by we, I'm talking about men here. I'm speaking on behalf of biblical men, right? So we should be humble persons. We should be protecting our wives, our children, our homes. We should be providing for our children, providing for our spouses, providing for the well-being of our homes. And we should also be leaders in our home. And here's probably where there's a lot of misunderstanding. What does it mean to be a leader in the home? I'm going to ask you guys to focus on Ephesians 5:25 to 32. The word sacrificial is thrown around a lot. Well, you should love your wife, love your children sacrificially. What does that mean? I think the Bible gives us a picture of what that means in Ephesians 5:2. What that means is that we ought to love our wives, for instance. And yes, if I really want to love my children, I start by loving their mother. I love my wife sacrificially. What does that mean? I love my wife the same way that Christ loved the church, in that he gave himself up for her. And the church is used in female pronoun there. Self-sacrificially, I am acting in a way that looks out for my bride's best interest, and by extension, the best interest of my children. It starts there, right? Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2. I live and I behave with selfless love. That's important. Again, looking out for her best interests. And consult some other scriptures, please, as I'm talking about this. John chapter 13, verses 14 to 15 comes to mind as well. We ought to be growing in godliness. We ought to be reading God's word. We ought to be molded by God's word. We ought to recognize that God's word is abundantly clear. 1 Peter chapter 3, read the first 7 verses. And Ephesians chapter 5, I mentioned 25 to 32, but I'm going to point you for a couple verses before that in Ephesians 5:21, that I love my wife, tells me how to love her, out of reverence for Christ, recognizing that she is my co-equal. She is made with equal dignity and value before God. She has the same spiritual value, the same inherent value that I have. That's something we read in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, because we are both made in the image of God. And when I disrespect her and when I demean her, if I disrespect her and demean her, then I am demeaning the image of God. Keep that in mind. I think we can learn a little bit from Trinitarianism here, in the sense that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are co-equal, co-eternal members of the Godhead, but they are different. They have distinct roles. That's kind of how we ought to think about this marriage arrangement, this marriage relationship, that I have equal value as my wife before a holy God. I just have a different role than she does. And so I went through some of those defining, differences in terms of manhood. So I just kind of lay it out there by way of introduction. That notion is under attack today. Wouldn't you guys agree? Any thoughts on that? Who's commenting? Is Jeff writing a sermon?
Linda said there's an attack on anything that we've known to be normal in order to bring in their own ideologies. A man has always been known to be what should be the foundation of the nuclear family. Anything that fits in the biblical description of a family is an offense to the radical left, that there is a rampage to shove their agenda down our throats.
All right. I wasn't going to talk about the radical left, but so yes, that's right. There's a political movement in the country, and it's consumed our academic institutions, and like I mentioned, our political institutions, and yes, our corporate institutions. And this ideology has as its primary target the nuclear family. And it is designed very much to erode and to attack traditional norms of sexuality and traditional norms, indeed, of maleness and femaleness. This isn't just an attack on what it means to be male, but it's an attack on what it means to be female. I mean, I would argue that how can you have a female if you don't have a pretty good idea of what it means to be male, right? Because these are mutually complementary roles. We are biologically designed to be mutually complementary, and then we procreate, but then it doesn't stop there. We enter into a society, and in order to be functioning, contributing members of that society, each of us has distinct roles. And as I've said many times in here with Nico, my wife has a set of strengths and weaknesses, and my strengths and weaknesses kind of fit hand in glove with hers. She complements me. She can do things I could not dream of doing. That said, we're not physically, and we are not psychologically, and we are not emotionally the same. We're equal, but we're not the same. And so those differences should be celebrated. They shouldn't be repudiated. And they shouldn't be lied about, eviscerated, like this political movement is doing across the country. It is the radical left. This is a Marxist ideology. That's why we call it left of the political spectrum. It is a Marxist, abusive, totalitarian regime. It is an outright attack on Americanism and the philosophy that undergirds Americanism, which is Judeo-Christianity. So any notions of traditional masculinity are under the gun right now. This is pervasive in gender studies departments across America's colleges and universities. It's absolutely pervasive. There's publication upon publication. It's in their syllabi. And when I say there, I'm being general, because you can go to any major college or university and you can look into their diversity, equity, and inclusion department, and you can see the kinds of curricular positions that they take on sexuality. And it'll just scream out at you. So very, very concerning. What is the church's role in all this? What should the church do? Any other thoughts?
Valerie's wondering, when do you think in American history that this began, where the castration of men began? I think it might have been during World War II, when women started working men's jobs while they were in battle. After the war ended, women liked the money, they earned too much. It might have also started to break up the family unit.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting theory. There may be some merit to that. I would probably point you to the late 60s. If I had to pick a political era or a societal era, I probably, the late 60s, it was definitely dominant in the 70s with the radical feminism movement. This is a movement that is steeped, quite frankly, in considerable dishonesty. And you've probably heard the term patriarchy thrown around. It used to be isolated to, again, academic institutions and gender studies departments, but it's pretty societal. The idea that a man should lead a home. How outrageous is that? So everything I just described from a biblical perspective of leading the home is seen as racist, at the very least bigoted, and they would probably consider everything I just said to be an outright moral attack on the very fabric of society. That's how these people see reality. So I think I would have to steep that in the 1970s with the radical feminism movement. I'm not talking about standard feminism that came out of legitimate complaints and grievances that women had in this country. I'm thinking particularly about the inability to vote, which was a legitimate civil rights concern. That battle was fought by both men and women throughout the 20th century and thankfully won. We have the result of those victories in civil rights laws of, I'm going to say Title IX provisions from 1967, right, that protect women and employment. We've talked about Title IX in here, not just Title VII, but Title IX. Title VII, I think, is employment. Title IX is the protection of women's facilities at universities, or they have a right to their own facilities, they're on the right to their own locker rooms, they're on the right to their own athletic facilities. I mean, these were decades and decades and decades of hard-fought wars that are now being thrown away by this insane, delusional cult. And I'm talking about the trans cult that is seeking to erase all differences between men and women and arguing incessantly and stupidly that men and women are fundamentally the same. I hope that answers your question a little bit. Let me give you a book to read that I think is fantastic. It's written by Mona Charen, Charen. It's called Sex Matters. She really does a great job analyzing the roots of this this cultic view of masculinity, and I think she diagnoses the contributions of the radical feminism movement very, very well. Anything else?
So, Eddie asks, what can we do now to stop the presidential executive orders that are unconstitutional? We're going political there, but
are we sticking to the topic here?
Yeah, what I want to say is that as I've watched movies and shows and stuff, I will say men and dads are looked at kind of as bimbos, and it's hard to pinpoint this movie at this minute. It's just everywhere, culturally speaking. I mean, it's everywhere in commercials to Netflix shows to movies and Hollywood movies and even in jokes, just day-to-day life. And I'm just wonder, is that it's not warranted, obviously, right? We as we've been talking about, each person has their individual role. Women, man, husband, wife, right?
Of course, but we can't be surprised that this is happening. I mean, this is a culture.
Why?
It's a culture of harassment, and it's inside our educational curricula. This is seen as the narrative. It's seen as the way to look at masculinity. So young boys are growing up with a very real and low self-worth. I mean, they think that the best thing they can do is be women. So, if I'm fundamentally messed up, then I'll just change. And, and of course now it's a fad. I mean, we have the average teacher is an activist in the public school classroom. They're recruiters. They're recruiting young boys and young girls into this death cult called the trans cult. Again, the idea that sex and gender are different, that you can be whatever sex you want to be, you can be whatever gender you want to be, and it's gone. I mean, it's really gone into the far reaches of insanity. Tyler.
It's insanity. It's insanity. There is no logic or cohesion.
It's a political movement that has become a religion, and that's really the reality.
With the goal to
it undermines traditional norms of the family. You have a mother. You have a father. First of all, you've got boys that grow up to be men. Men grow up to be, men become husbands. Husbands become fathers, and so forth. And then that pattern, of course, in a home where there's a mother and a father and children, that pattern is emulated. It's modeled in the home. Children learn that pattern, and guess what? They carry it from generation to generation, and it shouldn't be any surprise. This is how we built civilization after civilization. There's nothing controversial about this. But this is really sort of the fundamental strength of the American nation. We've very much adopted Judeo-Christian ethics and philosophy at the root of our founding documents, and our legal philosophy, our cultural philosophy, if you will, our social philosophy. This is deeply ingrained in the country, and it's fundamental to our strength as a nation. We've become the formidable economic and political power in the world. And that all began with a philosophy. Strong families, strong husbands.
So the point for kind of undermining a man is to ultimately undermine the United States of America.
You confuse men, you confuse women, you dismantle families. And so children are growing up increasingly dislocated from this pattern of order. And instead what they do is they kind of force feed self-gratification, which we've talked about in here a couple of times in the last several months as we hear more and more insane news about the proliferation of trans theology throughout our academic institutions. We've tried to ask you, for you guys that have children, please become involved at the grassroots level. Go talk to your teachers. Don't start fights. Don't be argumentative, but go have dialogue. with teachers. Go engage in dialogue with administrators at schools. Do that. Become informed. Know what they're teaching, and know your rights, for goodness sakes, and challenge anything that is abjectly insane, which is the idea that your son goes to, for instance, goes to school, a boy, and at school they tell him that he can be and is actually a girl if he wishes to be, and then when he comes home he can change into his boy costume.
But you know that
again.
leftist teacher slash, indoctrinate. I don't know the proper term, but somebody that's just not aware of the things happening in the world. Like they just kind of, even a teacher, and they're gonna like listen to your comments. They're gonna hear them out as a parent, but ultimately you're gonna walk out and they go, "This guy's cuckoo. He needs to come talk to me about 2 + 2, not the how to run my classroom."
But we don't see that. I mean, they're not teaching 2 + 2. That's the point. They're teaching 2 + 2 is equal to 5. That's the point. They're not teaching objective reality here. In fact, there's an argument behind this political movement is the idea that truth isn't objective, and the notion that truth is objective is a racist concept, if you can believe that. Truth is subjective. It's your truth, my truth. It's postmodern secular humanism, which is now codified into our academic institutions. It's very difficult to have. I mean, they exist. There's great teachers out there, but they're becoming fewer and far between. It's very difficult to have sort of rational, reasonable conversations with these individuals. They're activists, really. This is a pretty hostile environment to traditional views of sexuality. All right, what do we got? Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, we've got a Twitch. We got someone on Twitch watching. That's kind of cool. A couple people on Twitch.
Welcome.
We're on Twitch. We're on Facebook and YouTube streaming, so you can watch on any of those platforms. So that's awesome. Eddie asks, well, there's been executive orders that are attacking the Family Foundation. Recently, the abortion executive orders. So we're going political. Eddie's going political. He's going political.
Yeah, look, Eddie, I know it's probably a rhetorical question. I know you've engaged in this forum before. Thank you for joining us. And I know that you watch us on Sidebar. By the way, Nico and I are on Sidebar every Saturday morning on 1200 WOAI between 9 and 10. And there we do get political in the sense that we look at how these philosophies and how this insanity is really sort of percolating out into our political world out there, and how political parties are adopting this insanity and trying to legislate it. And I think that's what you're getting at. It's to the point where this very unstable and compromised president of the United States is just completely dismissive of the will of the people. People are not on board with the notion that transgenderism is a good idea. They're not on board with the idea of gender fluidity. This is a fraction of the population. Not that majority makes might or that majority makes right, but the point that I'm trying to make is that this president and his increasingly hostile cabinet to traditional American norms are unbelievably detached from where the country is. And they don't really care about debate. They don't care about the legislative process. They don't care that, we actually have these things called representatives in our government, and Congress gets to pass laws. I think their Respect for Marriage Act is outrageous. I pray to God that it collapses in the Senate.
What is that? Respect for Marriage Act?
Yeah, it's actually the Disrespect for Marriage Act. Yeah, it's really based on the ruse that when Justice Thomas wrote his concurrent opinion in the Dobbs ruling that thankfully collapsed Roe v. Wade and sent it back to the states, in his concurrent reasoning, he argued that he basically affirmed the rest of the court, the majority court, that the legal rationale of Roe v. Wade was weak and it was lame. And the nation had to suffer for 50 years under really just horrific legal rationale that in essence caused a great deal of harm on the country. I mean, we've got anywhere from 63 to 70 million precious souls that have lost their lives. And most of them on the altar of convenience. By the way, I'm not just saying that. This is an objective fact. Yeah, these are not decisions largely made because the life of the mother is legitimately at risk here. These are decisions that are being made for convenience. I mean, abortion is at a level where it's basically contraception. There's nothing controversial about that. It shouldn't be. Just look at the numbers. And these aren't Christian numbers. These are numbers that are actually put out by organizations like the Guttmacher Institute or in the abortions or surveillance reports by the CDC. Okay, look at the numbers. And this is where we are. We've demeaned human life. And Thomas basically said, hey, those are the social implications, but the legal rationale is indeed, as well as the majority court, it's shitty rationale, okay? And it needs to be tossed back to the states where it belongs. We should never have federalized abortion on this illusory, delusional notion of the right to privacy. So that's not even in the Constitution. And Alito's opinion explains that. So Thomas came out and said, hey, there are some other cases that are in question because of the same problem, okay? And yes, he happened to mention cases like Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized gay marriage in 2015. You with me?
Yeah.
And a couple of other cases, which I won't go into right now because they're not really relevant to the topic. But those cases are socially loaded cases. And so I highlight Obergefell v. Hodges because that's the premise of the Defense for Marriage Act. Oh my gosh, they want to outlaw gay marriage. They're coming after gay marriage. They've already outlawed abortion, which is a lie. It just simply went back to the states. And so guess what? A House majority came together, supported by about 40 Republicans, which is insane, came together and said, yeah, it's a really good idea to vote in the Respect for Marriage. We're going to codify same-sex marriage. Okay, but the problem is it goes beyond that. Do we really need to codify same-sex marriage more than a Supreme Court ruling that affirms gay marriage in 2015? Of course not. It's BS. What's really going on there? Included in the bill, and maybe this is what Eddie is ultimately getting at, included in the bill are provisions that would make it impossible for churches and faith-based institutions to take clear biblical positions, for instance, in hiring practices with regard to sexuality. It would make it discriminatory, and it will put you in the crosshairs of government. See, this is the kind of stuff that's buried in there. The idea that 40 Republicans would actually support it is insane. Anyway, the Senate still has to vote on it. In the meantime, Joe Biden, because the chances that this is going to pass in the Senate, I think, are bleak. Joe Biden comes right behind that and writes cockamamie executive orders, which really have no chance of surviving at the state level, certainly not in red states, that basically further the trans cult and give the trans cult additional funding and additional preference and pitches lots and lots of support and funding for gender-affirming care, which is outrageous. And so that's what's going on there. Do I think ultimately, Eddie, that these things are going to succeed? I don't. The country's really not behind this. Thank goodness there's plenty of red state legislatures. There's even some split and misalignment, thank goodness, in blue states. I don't think this is ultimately going to fly. We are trying, think about this. The President of the United States and at least one House of Congress is actually telling Americans to affirm a gigantic lie at the core of the existence of every basic human being. The idea that every male is a female if they want to be, and that every female is a male if they want to be. That's insane, okay? That won't fly. All right,
Big Bad
sermon's
Wolf,
over there.
Big Bad Wolf from on Twitch said that the downfall started when equality became the purpose of the law. Equality became the purpose of the law is when it started. So is that the purpose of these laws, is equality, or what is the purpose of the law? The purpose of the law, I mean, ultimately the purpose of our laws is to protect the sovereignty of the country, right? That's what we have a Congress for, is to represent us, go into DC, represent us on a national level, like meaning to protect our sovereignty, but we as the states, this is where we live and are governed, right? The federal government was supposed to be like way outside of our life. Am I wrong on that?
Well, I think terms matter, and I think that yes, and no. There's nothing wrong with equality is part of our.
And then
national
we're going to
fabric.
come back with them. We're talking about men and masculinity.
No, but I think this is part of the religion. This is a religious claim at the heart of the movement that that is behind notions of toxic masculinity and trying to shred traditional norms in the family and where gender and sex are concerned. This is a religious tenet, this notion of it's all about equality. See, you got to go beyond the slogan. It's always this very pleasant and seemingly moral pitch, and behind it is something that is absolutely devastating to the fabric of culture. So, yeah, look, we've talked many times in here of what equality means to this political movement in society. The constitutional basis of equality is being equal in dignity and value before God. Men and women are. Human beings are all equal, regardless of their race and their sex or gender. But that's not how equality is used here. This equality term is being used interchangeably with the concept of sameness. This is really at the heart here. It's an attack on any diversity of opinion or thinking. That's what's going on there. So basically, if you deviate from the norm, then you are disputing equality and you're a bad guy. In other words, if you have thoughts, if you have convictions, if you happen to have biblical convictions about sexuality or biblical convictions about what it means to be a man of God and a woman of God, and you ground those opinions on the Bible, right? You ground those opinions on the Bible, that's going to go against the status quo. Hey, brother, that's going to go against the status quo. So that is inherently an attack on equality. So we were just talking, I gave a summary on what masculinity is versus manhood. I wanted to differentiate between the two. Masculinity is exactly as it sounds. It's the physical and personality traits that are inherent to every red-blooded male, okay? And in manhood is what results from a appropriate use of those traits. And so, where do we go to get instruction on what manhood is? And then I talked about some concepts from the Bible. And then invariably we got into, okay, who's got a problem with that? And then we got into political movements in society that seek to undermine what the Bible teaches about manhood. Getting some really good comments.
Welcome, Nico.
Really happy for the engagement.
I don't know what they're asking.
So Valerie said to get back on top, maybe men should protest for the restoration of their manhood, just as women fervently protested for women's rights. It seems as though protesting is the most effective action. Squeaky wheel gets the grease.
But what grease are we getting? I don't understand. I'm no disrespect to Valerie. What does that get us? It just makes men whiny. There's nothing to protest. You just are a man, and you embrace manhood, and you understand what it means to be a man, and you know there's differences, even though they're loved equally, but not the same by God, because we have different roles and we have different duties to each other. So I'm not gonna beg for something back that should have never been taken in the first place. So
Okay.
that's just you start from a position.
Is it
of
even
weakness.
gone? Is it gone?
Well, I mean,
and they can't be taken.
well, I mean, what can't be taken?
Your maleness can't be taken, like you said. It's inherent to who you are.
I mean,
You're a man.
yeah. Well, I mean,
No one can take your manhood.
Well, I mean, people hand it over. You can have a penis and genitals, but that doesn't mean you're a man anymore. I mean, to me, it means you're a male. But I mean, manhood to me means something very different. I mean, it's strength, it's leadership, it's servanthood, it's sacrificial love. I mean, it's chivalry, it's manners, it's humility, but it's also being an animal. Exactly. I mean, I want men to be monsters, but not act like it. A monster. And I've said this before, and I don't remember who I heard it from, and you can fit it in with any weak animal, but a rabbit is not righteous. A rabbit is weak. If the rabbit wants to hurt the dog, it can't do shit to the dog. Can't do shit to anybody.
Sure.
So, I mean, it's a rabbit. It's not righteous. Now, a lion, if the lion treats the dog or the rabbit or the whatever animal that they normally eat, the zebra, well, then that's a righteous lion, because he's an animal. He's a beast. He can kill, but he doesn't do it because he submits himself to something higher than his own, strength. That's true chivalry. It's a martial arts way. It's a samurai way. If you study warriors, as I have at different times in my life, I haven't done it in a long time. But the samurai was chivalrous. But he was a beast, and men should be beasts. I mean, men should be able to act like men. Teach boys to be men. with all due respect, a woman can raise a boy well, and many women have to do it on their own, but she cannot substitute what a man can do. Two women can't substitute what a man can do. Two men can't substitute what a woman can do. There are certain things that only a woman can do, and that's the beautiful complementary roles of man and woman together, as Rocky says, to fill the gaps for each other, right? But I mean, my wife does things. I mean, look, I suck at a lot of shit. I mean, but there's a couple of things I'm okay at, and my wife does them wonderfully, and I don't even pretend. What'd you say, Tyler? I don't even pretend to fill that gap that she does.
Yeah, like there is it reversed too, right? If there's a household in it, is there a household that mom's gone and dad's trying to raise the kids? You know,
Sure.
Like, and that's God's order. And that's,
What am I going to do?
ultimate.
I mean, if it was up to me, my girls would be just a bunch of fighting animals. But I want them to be
They
girly.
would, too.
But you know what I'm saying? But they're tough, right? They do jujitsu, they do wrestling. You know,
they're confident.
I'm dealing with it. You know, one of them's crying, and I look. I mean, this is me, and look, I'm happy to be wrong. I tell my children, don't waste your tears. I don't want people to see you cry. Not for if someone passes away or you really hurt yourself, you're entitled to cry. And if you want to cry, but cry by yourself a little bit, you know. And whether I'm right or wrong on that, I mean, look, you can look at the book of Genesis, and Joseph in a powerful position. I've read at least four, maybe I'm trying to remember, 5 times he cried when he saw his brothers who betrayed him. The emotion, the reality, what he was dealing with, but he couldn't show it. He cried. One time he cried so loud that they heard him through the walls. He was crying so loud.
There's a time for it.
Absolutely.
And
But what I'm saying,
yep.
it's in our society, everybody's crying on Instagram.
That's absolutely
It's
correct.
too much. I mean, my point is,
they're men.
But even women, and I say this lovingly. Look, I'm more emotional at my age now with 4 children. Like women, they pull the emotion wire on me, you know, because you just have a heart. But I keep that between me and the Lord, and not that it's inappropriate. It's not bad. I'm not that guy that says, "Oh, men can't cry." I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that you can't cry all the time for everything. And if you feel like it, you should be, you know, by yourself maybe and kind of work that out. I mean, there's times I get emotional when I see something or something touches my heart, or if I'm worshiping by myself, or the Holy Spirit comes over me, or I'm watching something and I'm moved by something. And look, and I don't mind if my eyes get watery in front of my wife. Not that it happens much, but there's time. I mean, I'm very sensitive. I'm a sensitive dude, man. I really am, and I've covered it up for years with anger, with this, especially after my brother passed away. And so I'm trying to find that balance. Look, Jesus wept publicly, right? John 11:33. He wept. That's the only time he wept that I saw, that I read, I've studied. I mean, he was nervous in the garden in Matthew 26. I get that because he knew what was about to happen and he submitted himself to God. But he wept. Lazarus had passed away. He knew he was going to raise him from the dead. He sees Mary and Martha crying. He understands the heartbreak and the torture and the pain of separation. And he wept out of empathy.
And it's excellent point. And it's possible that he cried at other times. But,
don't know.
But
Yeah.
it's also reasonable to conclude that he was judicious, like he was when he cried, because his dear, dear friend Lazarus had died.
And he was smelling by that time too. He was stinking. It was 3 days. In the
So we deduced, you know, Jesus didn't go around, with tears in his eyes all the time. But what an excellent point. Now, are you just getting back to what you said about your girls? I got 3 girls as well, and I remember saying the same thing to them. What worried me, for instance, is that if they were crying and exchanging emotion, which is really the law of the land today. If they cried at the drop of a hat,
yes,
and
that's right.
and if everything's about the exchange of emotion, that's the way it is in culture today. I mean, virtually every institution in the country is gutted with this narrative of teaching men to be more and more effeminate, becoming and acting like women. In other words, tendency to men are biologically and I should say psychologically more prone to physical activity, competitiveness. They're inherently more, they gravitate more towards problem solving, whereas women are more about exchanging emotions and sort of working through emotional stresses. And there's a push to bring men down that spectrum. And
Many people would say that's misogynist.
No, this is just, they'll just have to deal with psychological realities. See, I live in the real world. I don't play games at the label level. To call somebody a label doesn't make you right, and it doesn't make you smart. It makes you lazy. That's the point. Don't call me a label. Tell me how. How is what I just said misogynistic? Yeah. Tell me how it's racist or bigoted. I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. I want to ask you. I want to ask you to make correct something.
I told my daughters, because my wife said, "Honey, I don't want you to stifle their emotions. I want them to feel free." And
Bobby's told me that.
And
too.
there's truth to that.
Yeah.
There's truth to that. So I'm very sensitive to that, and my wife has been unbelievably helpful. But I don't want my daughters to invite harassment.
That's exactly 100%.
That's the problem.
100%.
That's what I try to explain that to them. And when they were young, I don't really understand that. But as they've grown and they've interacted with society at large, and they watch social media, they can see that.
Well, look up and tell me this is similar. It's a similar analogy. So if the bully walks up and the kid, he goes, I don't want to fight. I don't want to fight. I'm scared to fight. Well, now you've given an invitation for this guy to be a prick and pick on you. I don't want to fight. Exactly. And to me, it's the same way as if someone can get you because they call you a name or you're not like so and so. Why don't you fit? Well, then what do I need to do to fit in? Because you have my emotions. To George's point, I'm exchanging this emotion. How can I fit in? How can I conform to you versus conforming to Christ? And so one of the things I've dealt with, so I got Leah, who's a beast on the mats. I mean, she's no emotion. I mean, she's kids, like, little boys. I'm gonna pin you. Or I'm gonna throw you down. She's like, yeah, whatever. And she smashes them 5 times in a row. But yet Zyther will say, I don't like the way you are. I wish you were another friend, so and so. And she's bawling. I'm like, Angel, what are you crying for? Zyther said this about me. He's my brother, and I love him. I go, you can still love him, but who cares what he thinks? I know he's your brother, but don't let anyone get you that easy, because now he can control you. I think this is the point George was trying to make. If you know either fear or sadness or whatever, if we over emotionalize ourselves, which we do, either it sends you down a road of depression or mental health, and that word is way overused in my humble opinion. But I don't want anyone controlling my children. I want their love for Christ to control them. Their desire to want to please the Lord, and these emotions are gifts. They're normal. But what I'm saying is, when they're overused, or you cry about everything, or you cry because you're rejected, even though I know that's not easy, but that's where I don't want. If they're crying or seeking that I want to be accepted, and their tears are showing that you can continue to goat me into doing. I mean, I'm telling you, that is a long life ahead of you, and a life of destruction, in my opinion.
And it's biblical advice. I mean, we're told.
I didn't even know that.
I mean, it's the flip side of self-control. I mean, in a sense that you're controlling your emotions.
Galatians
just like a biblical
5:22.
man should control his appetites, should control his impulses. 1 Thessalonians 4:3-5, right? And we shouldn't give in to every temptation that comes along. 1 Corinthians 10:13. So it's about self-control ultimately. And I would tell my son, because they'd have the same exchanges at home. My son would say something to go to reaction. And I would just tell my son privately, I say, hey, do you think harassing your sisters, sometimes he was just teasing. I didn't say anything to him. But other times he kind of crossed the line. I said, you got to really control yourself. Is that really necessary? Do you really want conflict in your life? Are you bored? Well, let me give you something to do if you're that bored. So I just try to get him to think about, is this a good idea? I mean, yeah, you can tease somebody, but sometimes you can cross the line. I want my kid to be reflective.
Well, I've told Leah, I've told Zyther this. I want our kids to figure it out. So if one's picking on the other one, you tell them to stop. You tell them to stop again. You try to walk away. They follow you. You make them stop. I mean,
but that coming from dad is a much
different than mom, right?
From mom.
Well, I guess I don't know how we got the hell on this topic.
No,
but it's all part of, in my opinion, manhood. And so, do you want your daughters to be manly? No, they're Proverbs 31:10 women. There's nothing
Which
weak.
we read last week.
Last week we read that, remember? And there's nothing weak about that woman. She is a badass. And the way you read that, it's like, man, you almost don't need your husband. He's just kind of there to be a sperm donor and help you out, because she's doing everything. I mean, she's a badass woman. Now, I say that facetiously, but I mean, she's a badass, and women are badasses. And a strong woman is biblical. And it doesn't mean she can't be emotional, passionate. Again, I say this again. I just think that movie 300 is a wonderful biblical reflection, biblical, not Christ-centered, reflection of a marriage. I mean, the queen is a badass. She's feminine. She's supportive. She submits to the king. He submits to her counsel. She gives him the nod when he kicks the shit out of the Persian. I mean, she's appropriate, but she's a badass. She's shanking that dude in the square.
And loyal.
And loyal and telling everybody off in the Senate square.
Mutual complementary roles, mutual respect.
It's just-
But guess who goes to battle? That doesn't mean she can't fight and
That's
she's
right.
not tough. But
That's
guess
right.
who goes to battle?
That's
And I
right.
only bring that up because this is replete throughout I don't think people realize and appreciate how grave our situation right now in terms of how young men are confused.
The testosterone levels are lower. Testosterone levels low. Men, look, let me tell you, I'm sorry, George, because I was watching this guy talk. Gosh, there's this dude. His name is Andrew Tate. I didn't know who the hell this guy is. I guess he's the most searched guy on the internet. He got canceled because he says some crazy shit.
Like a black dude.
He's half black. He's a
cop.
former. I don't know if he's a cop. He's a former kickboxing champion in the UK. He says some off the wall shit, but he's trying to teach. He really pushes manhood. Yeah, he says some stuff that's
Trying to get people to think.
Well, I think so. That's what he sees. I heard an interview that he was doing because I didn't know who this guy was. So I was just watching an interview yesterday and today. I didn't get through the whole thing. I don't have the time, but I was chipping away at it. And look, he should say whatever. I'm a free speech guy. You know that, George, and so are you. But he's really, young men are drawn to him. Young men are drawn to Jordan Peterson. Young men, they're starving for mentorship on manhood. And the church should be leading. Jesus was a badass dude, historically. He kicked the shit out of the people in the temple. He didn't say, "Oh, guys, in the name of me, get out of here." No,
And not just once.
Yeah, and he twice, right?
Yeah.
Twice.
That we know of.
People don't know of that. Where's the other one at?
I think John chapter 2 and I think Matthew 21.
Jesus is kicking the shit out of people, whether people like it or not. In one of the Gospels, it says he got bull hair and made a whip out of it.
Yeah.
And he didn't ask people. He's knocking over tables. Now, that's not every day. But it was in his repertoire. How about that? In Matthew 23, he's talking boldly to the authority and to the Pharisees. Dare I say, he used slang words. Brood of vipers, you whitewash tombs, you strain a gnat and you swallow a camel. You hypocrites, you're sending people to hell with. I mean, that was language that doesn't
That's
translate.
like saying
You
yeah,
dumb
right.
man, my first. I mean, it's strong language. Look, he's talking and he's being bold, but then yet he was gracious to the woman at the well. It was gracious to Zacchaeus. He was gracious to people. He was a friend of sinners, right? So he was humble and gracious to people, and that was his second indictment, a friend of sinners. But he was a man. He was a man's man. He loved his mama. He was very gracious to women. He trusted women. Women were the first ones to see that the tomb was empty. So this whole bullshit about misogyny is just, it's a straw man. That's just the wind. It's a straw man argument, and it's bullshit. I mean, women are strong. They're loving. I mean, they're just amazing, designed creatures of God. I mean, and I mean that lovingly, and they should be honored and revered. Like the queens that they should be in a home, and men should.
That's right. And
serve them
the
and
more
love
you go
them
after
and
men,
sacrifice for them.
the more you diminish men, the more you diminish women. That's the point.
I agree.
You don't elevate women by diminishing men at all. And like I was going to say, it's replete throughout society. And most recently, it's not really recently, I'd say within the last 5 to 10 years, you see more and more pieces on how this has affected our own military, which is absolutely insane. I mean, the military is at a point now where it is no longer lethal, in my view. And I think if you look at what's being written, that people are coming out of the military, it's not combat ready, and it's largely because of this philosophy so deeply entrenched. Yes, that's right. West Point, for example, in 2017, adopted this toxic masculinity bullshit. Think about that for a moment.
badass
Our nation's premier military academy.
But
You don't think VMI is the same way, Virginia Military Institute? Think about what that means on the battlefield. We already have data on that.
China is not. They don't give a shit about being politically correct. They don't want their men. They want their men are badasses. I mean, their men are warriors, and they love this stuff. They love this sterilization of our men. They love it. I mean, because it shows weakness. I mean, there's nothing toxic about biblical masculinity. Now, what people mean by toxic, in my opinion, about toxic masculinity is that dumb dick, machismo dude that's like, hey, vieja, give me my beer, or hey, do this and do that, and doesn't open the door for a woman and doesn't stand up when a woman approaches a table.
That's what the feminist movement's built around. Is that type of mentality.
Yeah, but those
But
are
see, that's a straw man argument, because those aren't men, those are bullies, and they need their ass kicked by a man, by a man to kick the shit out of them. I mean, that's not a man, that's a bully. That's not a biblical man. There's nothing toxic about masculinity, about true biblical masculinity, nothing at all.
what becomes toxic, like we mentioned before, is what you do with it. That's the point. And manhood is the righteous application of masculinity. That's the idea here. You can abuse anything. We've talked about that a lot in here, I think, about how you take an ideal, you abuse things, and then you fall short of the ideal. That's what's going on here. But I'm deeply, deeply worried about the idea that we are subjecting women to situations that they are not designed for. It's abusive. Talk about truly, Tyler, misogynistic. If you diminish
what's the
men,
definition of that? What do they use? How they use
it's
that?
a man hater. It's a woman hater. Excuse me. If you
A
have
woman, think about this. A woman hater. Okay, think about that. Because I had an idea.
I'm summarizing. I'm
Okay.
cutting to the
Okay.
chase.
A woman hater. So how is the transgender movement not a woman hating movement?
It is.
That's my point.
It is.
So you got some dude with a big package kicking the shit out of women in swimming, and he's in this suit, and it's disgracing the beauty and the splendor of womanhood. Womanhood is beautiful, and God honors it, and because it's His design. And so, how is the transgender movement not woman hating? True woman hating.
It is, though.
That's what I knew
It
the
is.
answer, but I'm just saying
And
it is.
And again, I want people to understand. You pick an institution in the country. I don't care what it is.
Google.
This is pervasive. Any corporation, certainly big tech, any corporation, virtually every public college and university. This is embedded as part of their curriculum. Now, this is theology there. It's everywhere. We already know what's happening politically inside the Beltway. We know that. At state houses, we get it. I mean, it's everywhere, and it is in the military. And I want to emphasize that, because that's where you really see women being hurt. It's actually dangerous to women. I don't know if you guys knew that males between ages 18 to 25 were required to register for the draft, part of the selective service system of the country. We haven't done that since 1973, thankfully. But in July of 21, the Senate changed that act to include women. So women now between the same ages have to register. Okay? Now think about that. We have a serious combat readiness problem. We are subjecting soldiers to really, really harsh and dangerous conditions on the battlefield that women are not physically able to sustain.
As a whole, right?
Generally,
we're generalizing.
No, but I want to be very, very clear about this. When you look at combat readiness proxy examinations, where they subject to tests, it's 92%. Only 8% of women are faring through the first stages.
I got that. But that's what I'm saying.
Of course, there's always exceptions to the
it's
rule.
an anomaly. There's an anomaly. There's a small sect of women that are just amazing and badass. I get that. But that's not the norm, is what
There's
we're
8%
saying.
of men that are kind of,
Oh, brother, there's more than that these days.
True, but I mean, but the stats are all like that. I mean, you could get really crazy and go, I don't know, number of pull-ups. Okay, in the military, the number of pull-ups that a male can do is 4 times what a woman can do. Like what I'm saying is controversial. Men have physical infrastructure that allows them
Bone
to be
density,
warriors.
muscle structure,
That's what they're
everything.
designed
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
And the idea that you subject women to these kinds of conditions, talk about not giving a shit, is my point. These aren't defenders of women. These are true misogynists. That's the point. And we haven't even thought about the implications of putting men with women in barracks and what that means in terms of sexual assault and rape. We have data on this stuff. And then you put them out in a combat situation for over a month, right, where men have nothing but a rucksack and they're out there extremely unsanitary conditions. Women do this thing called menstruate. Last time I checked, that opens them up to urinary tract infections in conditions like that, yeast infections out the wazoo. Do they give a shit about that? Of course not. This is a religion. It's a political movement.
There's a difference.
That is religious in nature.
100%. There's a difference between fighting and violence. See, there's women that can fight, but there's not a whole bunch of women that can engage in violence. That's a different deal. Violence is something very different than fighting. I mean, to see true violence, and I mean, I'm talking murderous violence.
But fighting is violence.
No, I'm talking violence. I'm talking eye gouging, throat slashing, shooting up right in your mouth. I'm talking stomping on someone's head
Like
until their
aggression on the
brains
battlefield, doing
until their brains
everything
come
to
out.
debilitate and
I'm
stop the
talking
enemy.
about
Yeah.
rock on the head, hammer in the. I mean, I'm talking about violence. Knocking someone out is great. I mean, it's a good skill to have to defend yourself. I'm talking about violence. There's a difference because I can be violent and not be a good fighter. Do you see the difference? I mean, someone can be a good fighter but not very good at violence. And when you look at men's structure, men are structured for violence. And I'm not saying that's a good thing all the time, but it needs to be in your repertoire.
Set aside all your inhibitions to neutralize an enemy. On the
Absolutely.
battlefield. Yeah.
I mean, look. We fight from here, but in the old days they fought hand-to-hand combat. It's a completely different fight. I always tell people when you look at a violent scene, a murder scene, the shooting and the stabbing, completely different scenes. Completely different
He's
scenes.
talking about the physical manifestations.
Oh, brother,
but
a knife is brutal.
But you got to be psychologically wired different.
Brutal.
That's the point.
Yeah.
There are just tons of psychological and emotional and biological differences. And it doesn't do us any favor to blow off those things and pretend they don't. See, China, you mentioned, they live in the real world. Say what you want about China. It is a grotesque, it is. It's a grotesque political system. It's Maoist. By the way, I just want to point out, we hear a lot of shit about Hitler. Hitler was a novice compared to Mao. And yet today, this is really interesting. You go to China, and what do you see on their coin? Whose image? Mao Zedong, right? Hitler wiped out anywhere from 8 to 12 million people, right? Wow. How many people do you think Mao Zedong is responsible for? He died in 1976, right?
76.
Revolutions around 1946, culminated in ended in 1949. How many deaths do you think he's responsible for? Do you have any idea how many citizens the dude wiped out?
10 million.
No.
We're pushing 60 million people. He makes Hitler look like a novice, and Stalin's even worse. Hitler's like number 3 in terms of body count. China, say what you want. It is a disgusting political system over there. These people are evil. Say what you want, but they live in the real world. And so we can have the Constitution, we can have the Declaration of Independence, we can have lofty ideals, right? But if we abandon those ideals, man.
Well, think about David. Think about David.
We're defenseless.
David exhibited violence. Right? He knocked down Goliath with a rock. He didn't kill him with the rock. He took his sword.
Joshua, yeah.
Joshua, Caleb, all of them. I mean, he took his sword out and hatchet. Now, again, we're not advocating this. We're just saying that this is something that is unique to a man as a whole. And manhood should incorporate the ability to get to that level, but under control.
You do advocate it in certain
Well, yeah, I'm talking about as a lifestyle.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about capability.
That's not your mode.
No. Lifestyle and capability is two different things. I seek peace, but I'm prepared for violence.
Okay,
right?
but this analysis doesn't exist in graduate school. That's all we're saying.
Yeah,
This
that's it.
kind of back and forth and recognition of the obvious, and then talking about, well, what does that look like in
The
society?
martial arts
This
way.
isn't
That's why
happening.
I've always advocated martial arts training for children, for adults too. I mean, think about it. People freak out at MMA fighters and boxers, how they can try to knock each other out and then pick each other up when they're done and be respectful and courteous. That's a true martial artist. Someone and how can you turn that on? You just can. You
right.
train to turn. I mean, you have to be able to.
Yeah.
You don't live at that mode. You're capable. That's why I'm saying it's
That's
not
not default.
No, it's capability. I can turn it on when I need to, but it's not where I live at every day. And that type of manhood is strength under control, which is, by the way, called meekness, not weakness. Meekness is strength, but under control. You're submitted to the Holy Spirit. You're submitted to your love to your wife. You humble yourself. That it's servant. It's servant leadership. How can I serve my wife well, better, lovingly? How does God expect them? What does God expect me to love my wife? And sometimes I'm not capable of doing that, so I just keep my mouth shut. Because I'm not capable, so I just say, Lord, I need your help. I talk it out, and I've completely submitted myself to Christ.
And this is the problem. And again, I realize that there are some amazing single women that are doing yeoman's work in the home.
100%.
But that's really far shy of the ideal. It's important to have a father in the home.
And I think
it
that
is
a lot
to
of them would
teach-
agree with that.
Indeed,
overall,
and really the social research bears that out. To kind of frame for a son, right, for a boy, what this means, right? That you as a boy, you've been given certain uniquenesses, certain traits, certain personality aspects because you're masculine. Now, how do you conduct yourself in a way that's honorable so those things can benefit society and they can benefit your family? See, the Judeo-Christian norm and ethic in the country, Tyler, was helpful to nourish and shape young men so that they wouldn't be in default mode, aggressive default mode, violent default mode, disrespectful default mode, right? That
they are by nature.
That's right. Well, they would temper those things to something higher than themselves, and this was pervasive throughout the culture. Not everybody was a Christian, but the ethic, meaning what do you do in certain situations, right? That was pervasive throughout American culture. And as we erode that, and then we confuse the shit out of these kids, you end up with more and more dislocation, and you end up with more suicidal
we're
ideation.
screwed.
No, but young men.
No, there's hope in Christ,
hungry.
brother. But we got to
They're
talk about the
hungry.
problem.
They're
Go ahead.
hungry for this, and that's why these
are
people
hungry.
are being. I'm telling you, I'm actually fascinated because I just heard of this guy 2 days ago or 3 days ago.
Andrew Tate.
Yes, I guess he was canceled after 2 million people on TikTok because he said some saying controversial things is not my point. Why I'm bringing him up? It's because he has this hunger for young men, and young men are attracted to him. Young men, I don't mean that way sexually.
Yeah.
I'm talking about young men are
His
drawn
ideas.
to him, his ideas and his boldness. I mean, he really speaks out against depression. He speaks out. I mean, again, not that people aren't depressed, but the labels. I mean, a lot of the stuff I heard him say today and a little bit yesterday that I heard, I agreed with. Now his style is different. Some of the stuff. What?
Is it Brandon Tate?
Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate.
Bald dude. He's like a 4-time world kickboxing champion in the past. They canceled him everywhere, like one sweep. Of course, all the social media platforms canceled him at the same time. He moved over to Rumble. He's blowing up over there. They just made him more popular, like they normally does. That's him right there, I think.
And
I think that's him.
when boys do manifest totally normal traits in schools, what's the default position? Medicate them.
Yes, and that's bullshit,
Right?
man.
This isn't-
SSRI drugs.
Right. About 25%, I think, something like that, of the population are on those types
Is that
of
like depression,
of mood
Selective
altering.
serotonin
Yeah.
reuptake inhibitors,
Like
and they all have.
Adderall and
Yep,
that
we're-
kind of
we're-
stuff?
it all have side effects, bad side effects, not just not just physical, but psychological. Bad side effects.
But a medicated culture is increasingly unable to deal with reality. And this is seriously.
Because we're not trained up to do that.
We are
Look,
not.
the human species, the human being can take a lot of stress. Scripture prepares us for it. It's part of God's recipe, as we taught on Wednesday to the men. We're going through 1 Peter 5. We just finished up 1 Peter 5. I think we finished up 1 Peter 5. But we were talking about that's just part of God's recipe, the maturation process of persevering, of going through some hardship.
That's right.
It's just, and Jesus modeled it for us. So, it's look, if you want to get strong, you have to stress out your muscles. You want to get tough, you got to get knocked around a little bit. You want to get smart, you got to strain your brain. You want to get spiritually mature, you got to test your ideas and test your faith. And God does that. So stress is needed. So perseverance is needed for maturity.
Amen.
It's just the way it is.
That's right.
So, I don't know where we're at in time.
So
I guess we're almost finished.
this is a conversation that every church should be having.
Comments or questions?
Yeah, people are commenting and
Well, anything we need to respond to before we wrap up? We're going to wrap up here. Sorry I was late, guys.
yeah,
What? Nothing at all?
no.
All right. I don't know.
No, I was going to part on that point.
Go ahead,
That
please.
every church should be having this conversation. Certainly, high school, upper year, young adult classroom should be having this conversation. There is an absolute crisis in this country with regard to young males being confused, and the unemployment rate of males has never been higher. You've got college graduates that are predominantly women. It's 60-40 right now, 60% to 40% of men. It's anticipated in the next few years it's going to be about a 2-to-1 ratio. You have men who are increasing, like I said, unemployed. They don't have a degree. They don't have or vocational training. They don't have employment. If they don't have employment, they're increasingly unmarried. What does this say for the future of our families? Please be prayerful about that. Be praying about how you might have these conversations in your local church, and talk about how you can, educate your young ones, Really, they need to be armed. See, they go into school and there's a narrative in front of them. And then Nico and I always ask people, what do you say in return? What are you going to say? You know, what's your response? What's your counter? What's your alternative? And so we're sitting here talking about biblical manhood. We should be preparing our children to have those conversations. So be prayerful about that.
Yeah,
this is serious business.
Yeah, it is serious business, and so at some point we're going to be doing a series, a seminar on biblical manhood, and spiritual samurai. You can name it. I have a bunch of names that I want to call it, but I mean what it means to be a servant leader in your home, to love your wife the way Christ loved the church, to sacrifice, not be selfish prick, to sacrifice and serve someone, knowing that that's your duty to do that you put yourself last. By being in front, you put yourself last. But that's what every leader should do. There's the difference between management and leadership. You're not here to manage your home. You're here to lead your home, and you inspire your wife and inspire your children and inspire people around you. That's true leadership. It's not dominating someone. It's inspiring them with strength, compassion, love, affirmation, correction, rebuke, all of it. You can't do it without Jesus. So with all that said, have a blessed week, guys. Anything else, Tyler, before we wrap up? Nope, wrap up.
Hey, we got a lot of people watching from Twitch and YouTube today. It's
Oh,
pretty
thanks,
cool.
guys.
Pretty awesome.
Appreciate it.
Hope to have you
Thanks
guys
for being
back.
here. God bless you guys. Have a blessed week. Wonderful week.
Wow.